Okay, welcome everyone. We are here today in order to discuss the topic Whither Post-Unipolar West. In other words, we will discuss civilizational and societal challenges for the West in the emerging multipolar global order. The issue is, well, what could and should a post-unipolar version of the West become? This question is, I believe, of major importance and significance, but as far as I can see, it is not only is it rarely addressed and discussed, it has not even been quite properly grasped and formulated by large parts of for public discourse. So the goal of today's discussion is to help to shape this discussion as well as to make some substantial contribution. The discussion will broadly go as follows. To start off, we will talk about what the West is and how well we relate to it, or how the three participants of today's discussion relate to it. Then we will analyze the current historical moment and the West's place in it. Then we will interrogate the absence of awareness and of imagination within the West regarding this inevitable transition. And then we will look into ideas regarding how to better grasp or even tackle this challenge, and then follow up on whatever will have come up. So my name is Stefan Heb, and I am extremely pleased to welcome Glenn Diesen, Arnaud Bertrand, and Matthew Ehret. I consider all three to be among the most insightful analysts regarding contemporary geopolitics and world affairs. And I'm very pleased really to they all agree to take part in today's discussion. All three have a wide horizon, but it's still fair, I think, and worth mentioning areas of particular knowledge, which are, in the case of Glenn, Eurasian integration and the Russian world. In the case of Arnaud, well, the Chinese world. And in the case of Matthew, I would say the Anglosphere world. So for the starting round, may I ask you to comment on, develop on what the West is to you, what is the West, and how you personally relate to the West. And one more thought to launch this. But the West, actually, as far as I can see, nobody really has a clear view on what the West is, but is a crucial issue, and it's an underlying issue for many, many things. And the problem, as far as I can see, is related to the double issue that on one hand, the West is a very comprehensive, a very pervasive thing as a civilizational force, maybe as the biggest thing that has ever existed and influences basically everything around the planet on one hand. And on the other hand, it's not quite clear what the unity or the uniformity of this West consists of. Well, based on this, may I, please, let's go ahead with this session. Who wants to start? Arnaud, let's go ahead. Sorry.
Me? Yeah, sure. I can go ahead. So what is the West? It's indeed a very interesting question, and something that's surprisingly not really spoken about much. I've read your article today, Stefan, and you mentioned the lack of Westologists, and it's true. It doesn't exist. There aren't that many people studying the West. In your article, I think you give 4 different angles to understand what the West is. One is a more historical angle, where it's those countries rooted in Romanized, Germanized, Christianized Western Europe, and the countries that emerged from that, and that then went around the world and started colonies and so on, and on those colonies as they grew, like the US. Are also part of the West, or the Anglo world, the Five Eyes, and so on. It's the historical view. The institutional angle that you gave was the West is defined by basically the EU, NATO, and I guess the Five Eyes on the G7, sort of the Washington, London, Brussels axis, kind of. And then there is the kind of ideological angle, which is basically those defending liberal democracies and universal value. There's the positive ideological angle. And there is the negative one where it's those, old colonialists that seek to maintain hegemonic power over the world. So it's kind of, there are many different ways to go about it. Personally, I think a very interesting question. I wrote a post today about that. That could actually contain many keys to solving many of the problems that the West faces, is whether Russia is part of the West or not. And I think that a very good case can be made that it is part of the West. If you look at Russia's history, before communism, they had the Romanov dynasty during like 300 years. And they were considered like fully European royal family, and they were intermarrying with all the European royals and so on and so forth. And even before that, there was the dynasty that came right before the Romanov, the Rurik dynasty. They also had very deep ties with the rest of Europe. So, for instance, Ivan the Great married Sophia Palaiologos, I don't know how you pronounce your name, who was the niece of the last Byzantine emperor. So that connected Moscow to both Byzantine and Roman imperial traditions. And of course, Russia's development often paralleled and emulated the rest of the West. So in the 19th century, for instance, Russia was very much part of the great game of imperial rivalry, carving for itself large parts of Central Asia, forcing China to cede territories through unequal treaties, like the UK did, and so on and so forth. Or you could look at things like the Russian language, which belongs to the Slavic branch of Indo-European languages, like Polish, Czech, or Serbian. And they use the Cyrillic alphabet, which is derived from Greek letters, which is also classic Western heritage. So why does this matter, and why can this have very big implications? Well, first of all, it will explain some things, like why so many figures in Europe, and more in the US, in Europe, like in Hungary and Serbia, are receptive to Russia's current vision of a more traditional conservative society. That ideological resonance suggests that rather than an East-West divide where we're speaking about different civilizations here, we are witnessing, maybe with Russia, a deeper struggle over competing interpretation of Western civilization itself. And some in the West are drawn to Russia's embrace of traditional Christian values, hierarchical social structures, and so on, elements that were once central to Western identity, but have been to a large extent rejected by modern liberal democracies. And another big implication is that if we see Russia as part of the West, then the current war in Ukraine is in many ways a civil war in the West. And so where the World War I and World War II, a lot of the major conflicts in the 20th and 21st century with the Ukraine war, which suggests that one of the biggest challenges to global stability isn't about defending Western value, as a lot of Western leaders like to say. It's not about defending Western values against external threats, but rather about managing competing visions of modernity that's emerged from Western civilization itself. And it also implies that the nature of the US-China great power competition is profoundly different than what we saw during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, or what we're seeing with Russia now, because no case can be made that China is part of the West. So it will help us to really, separate the competition with China from what we're seeing with Russia right now, when it's often put in the same basket. So I think this question is actually has very, very deep implication. What is the West can help us see a lot of things through different angles and bring new answers to many of the questions that we ask ourselves.
Thanks a lot, Arnaud. How about Matthew? You want to continue?
And Glenn, would you like it, or should I go first?
Either way, we're all awfully polite here, so
Rock,
yeah,
paper,
you
scissors.
want
No,
to start.
I'll I'll go. Sure.
Yeah, sure.
No, thank you, Arnaud, and thank you, Stefan, for organizing this. And I think the conversation, indeed, I agree that it is too rare, and I think that there's too many analysts and commentators out there who immediately either come to the conclusion, if you watch corporate media, that the that somehow the West is destined to rule, or inversely that we have nothing worth saving in the West, that it's entirely crap and must be destroyed, or must fall because we are so obviously corrupted, and we don't have any standards upon which to base any viable reforms for ourselves. And I think that sort of cynicism clouds our ability to think very concretely about problem solving, because the reality is we are in an existential moment. I tend to look at the economic system quite a bit as a factor in the drives for war, and I think we all do. And the fact that we're sitting currently on a systemic breakdown of the Western transatlantic banking system is not to be detached from the considerations of geopolitical conflict, especially the obsessive efforts to destabilize the Eurasia and the growing multipolar system, which has a very different operating system, a different philosophy of what is value, what is self-interest, what is security, that we see animating a lot of the very creative flanking maneuvers and decisions, whether it's in regards to the Middle East or Africa, or Eurasian integration of the global South. There's just a different idea, and it's not like it's so easy to categorize the way many American commentators are, that it's either capitalism or communism, as if somehow, I feel sometimes as though we just like walked out of a time capsule of the Cold War. When you hear some of the discourse, it's literally like we came out of 1959 McCarthyism, that the commies are out to destroy the capitalist world order. And I mean, it's thought we got over that. I thought we realized that was a completely oversimplistic lie, but apparently not. People are still drinking that Kool-Aid because it was never resolved. But you look at it, and I think that there is an idea that isn't capitalist, that isn't communist, but it is profoundly based upon maintaining civilizational values, utilizing the power of the sovereign nation state as an active instrument for the benefit of people, both within Russia, within China, within their associated array of allies, of nations that are working together, and emitting decisions, or emitting credit tied to decisions that are based on long-term projects that increase abundance, that increase food production, industrial production, infrastructure, the things that we've permitted in the West. I mean, anybody could look at any metrics of those variables over the last 40, 50 years, since we have essentially been told to embrace a consumer society, a post-industrial economy as it was sold back in the 70s in the West. All of those factors have degraded economically. And instead, the thing that we've been stupid enough to allow to be considered value is tied to infinitely growing arrays of bundled securitized debts that we gamble upon. The idea of just gambling itself, where you're basically, it's not, in my mind, it's not a legitimate form of investment, like, or of money creation, or value creation. Gambling is, as it's done on Wall Street since especially the liberalization era of the 80s onward, around derivative markets, spot markets, futures markets, just gambling on any little variable. Is there going to be a weather derivative? What do you think the price of Coca-Cola is going to be next month based upon whether it might rain in Portugal? Like there's so many things that they can make money out of thin air, which if you look at it, I mean, it's something like 40 times more than the world GDP as far as like just pseudo measurable. If you think of the GDP as being the measurable aspect of what is measurably wealthy or value, which even that is very questionable if that's even like a viable metric anymore, since they make things up and the statistics are not believable. But even there, if you did believe it, it's still like 25 to 30 times more uh, nominal value in derivatives than there is GDP globally. So it's detached from reality. It's a fantasy, and we've been pumping banks with you know quantitative easing, other things since 2008. So that thing is breaking down, is rupturing at the seams. And the question is, with all of the turn to empire, the embrace of empire that we've permitted, especially over the dead bodies of John F. Kennedy, his brother Robert, um, is the West viable? Is there anything in it? And your considerations of Russia, of Eastern Europe, are they West? What is the West? I think these are good considerations. I'm thinking as well about. I've written a book, a series of books, um, on the clash called "The Clash of the Two Americas," Volume 1 to 4, where I tried to map out is that very question: is there anything that is good that is salvageable within the West? What are the true traditional? What is the heritage? And of course, the thing that punctuated my mind is the fact that so many American presidents died while in the position of office, and they weren't all doing the same thing, but there was 8 who died, while serving as president, and indeed 4 by bullets, 4 by questionable means, maybe not bullets, maybe or not bullets, but maybe poison. And I think that likely from Harrison to Zachary Taylor to Lincoln to Garfield to McKinley to who McKinley died in 1901, to Warren Harding, to Franklin Roosevelt, to John F. Kennedy, and then you could consider his brother. If you look at the policy package, domestically and foreign policy, there's something that is tied to their appreciation for the Constitution and the active role of the Constitution in banking to varying degrees. They all have a similar idea that that Wall Street has to be reined in and serve a higher good than simply profit. They all are oriented towards, again, to varying degrees, an idea that America's sovereignty must be legitimized through its assistance of neighbors that have been abused by colonial exploitation. And generally speaking, and I can include Ulysses Grant, who did survive, and Ben Franklin, they had an idea that we couldn't go out looking for monsters to destroy. We shouldn't go seeking, or John Quincy Adams said this as well, we shouldn't go seeking enemies to justify our expansionism or our some romantic idea of ourselves that could easily lead us into empire. So there is something there, and I think that I think that didn't come out of something good from specifically the U.S. colonies. I think that they were in 1776 when those documents were being crafted, the Declaration and the Constitution in 1787, that they were representing a better heritage of the West, of European culture, that's been sort of scrubbed out of history. And I'll say the last thing. I was just reading Peter Thiel's 2007. I don't know if you guys read that. Peter Thiel's The Straussian Moment. Did you guys read that?
I think I did. Yeah.
It's really valuable. It's a valuable piece. It's a little essay he wrote in 2007, and it's really useful because, I mean, this is a gentleman who's I don't want to call him a gentleman, but whatever he is, he's on the Bilderberger steering committee. Palantir is a high level fake civilian, front for the CIA. We all have an idea what that is. And anyway, the Straussian moment, he correctly situates himself within the Straussian tradition and reevaluates all of history, going back from the days of Plato and Jesus through Hobbes, the greatest philosopher, to Locke, the greatest philosopher, and he's recharacterizing all of history in a way that only Straussians tend to do. We're all interpreting an esoteric and an exoteric uh, tradition, asserting that, like Strauss, that Plato had a secret teaching for his special favorites, and then a stupid thing that you could read in the Bible, or not in the Bible, you could read in his dialogues. And he says the same thing. He describes how Locke also taught that Jesus had a secret teaching for his favorites, and something dumbed down for the masses that he could speak exoterically about. Um, and that the idea of what he would like Western civilization to be from that narrative is one that is run by cast of noble liars that tell sacred myths to make people as satisfied with the status quo as humanly possible. And he says that there's whole domains that Hobbes and Locke agreed. Both Hobbes and Locke were grand strategists representing the interests of empire and the expansion of the creation and expansion of the British Empire. John Locke did, after all, work for the British Royal Africa Company and made a fortune off of the slave trade, on top of, creating a philosophical framework justifying the idea that humans can be property. But he says that all of these thinkers inspired the American Revolution, that the American Revolution and the American system directly came out of that tradition. And I know from my research that that's not true. It's a lie. But they created these sacred stories in order to maintain their power. Because if Americans actually did, or Westerners in general actually did look at their deeper heritage and look at who was refuting Locke, who was refuting Thomas Hobbes, who were the people who were risking their lives to keep England from becoming an empire, like Thomas More or Erasmus, or Robert Harley and Jonathan Swift. If you actually look at their writings, you get a sense of a much more interesting, much more inspiring drama that shapes our heritage. And the fact that many of those people got killed, that they got ousted, that they didn't succeed in their battles against this deep state thing, doesn't mean that we should say that, well, they don't shape our heritage. It's just that we didn't pick up the torch after they fell. And instead we allowed ourselves to believe a new set of mythologies crafted and promoted by people like Strauss, like there's a myriad of these creatures that were sponsoring the transformation of the Republican Party into a neoconservative, which is what Strauss was. He was sort of him and these former Trotskyists were sort of inspiring the transformation of the Republican Party away from McKinley, away from Lincoln, into this thing that would be unrecognizable and deplorable to any actual real Republican. And I can only hope that there's some sense of a latent reflex towards recapturing what America's Republican heritage was as an anti-slavery, anti-imperial party and movement, representing something more than a party, but something much more tied to the better part of Western tradition. So I'll just end it with that. Yeah, that's my consideration.
Yeah. Well, again, a lot's been said, of course, but yeah, what is the West? I think it's a great topic which is also a good thing you wrote this Substack, because I think it's I think one obviously will disagree, one tries to unpack, but it is interesting that when you see the rest of the world, we're speaking about the collective West. It's they're usually then referring to the political functions, which is why people like Richard Sakwa favors this term political West instead. But otherwise, one of course will be more tempted to look towards the common history, identity, or as a civilizational concept. But I think the reality is of it that the West as an entity has really been formed by military and economic power. That is the cohesion of it, which is why I think it's important to differentiate between what is the West and what makes the West act as a single entity. But I do agree with many of the comments which have been made. But first, I also would like to say that I think the West has been very strong, if not influential, in what defined it as. Most of it has been based, well, initially on the pre-modern, but then because it also had such a leading position under modernity, especially with liberalism, I think it's had more those contradictions or tensions between the pre-modern and the modern. But also agree with this idea of superiority, that this is something that also defined the West, because it's been almost, it's been more than 500 years now since the Western maritime powers set out to reconnect the world, and in that process, of course, building their empires and having this very asymmetrical relationship with the rest of the world. By the way, something Adam Smith wrote about as well, that this asymmetry is, as we will reconnect or discover the world, it was also done under such asymmetrical conditions that it subordinated and much of the world, and in his words, ended up destroying many of the peoples which the West came to meet. But I think this has been also defined some of the past centuries of the West's history. That is this hierarchy, which the West has claimed a position of superiority. Again, the world consists of many hierarchies, so it doesn't have to be necessarily negative. And I think that's also been a key goal, if you will, of the West, is to define the hierarchy as being benign. That is, ideally, hegemony would be a good concept, which is why if you look back in 19th century, it's formed a lot of this colonization is formed under the guise of a civilizing mission. So yes, we're dominating the world, but we're also bringing civilization, rule of law. So again, benign dominance, to be a force for good, something we still say today. So in the 19th century, we had the British, they had their liberal empire, which many argued, well, yes, we are dominating the world, which contradicts liberalism, but this is how we spread our values. And today we pretty much continue this exact same discussions, but now under liberal hegemony, in which effectively, the dominance of the West, or hegemony, is, or liberalism is treated as a hegemonic concept to a large extent. That's seen as the condition for advancement, that as long as the West rules, this kind of developments or positive reforms will continue. Now, I think for this reason, there's always going to be some splits within the West as well. Some people celebrate the West for spreading a lot of from back in the day, spreading. Well, it's not so great to say it now, of course, but back then, spreading civilization, rule of law. Now we're talking about spreading the liberal ideals, democracy. So some would like to take pride in spreading these ideas. Others would rather condemn the West. So then you have obviously this split where some see it as being imperative to preserve the essence of the West, while other condemns it, almost seeking to throw out the baby with the bathwater. But so I think some of these divisions comes from the superior role that the West has had, but I would also add that the cohesion of the West, because often when, as mentioned, we speak of the West, we speak of the political West as more or less one entity. Whether or not this is by consensus or just obedience to Washington, irrespective of this, it's worth noting that this is a very historically unusual time in history, because a unified and cohesive West, or even Europe, it only emerged, I think, under very extreme and well, maybe not extreme, but unique historical conditions. Because throughout Europe's history, we'll always try to find a way of creating this cohesion of political West, usually through efforts of diplomacy and war, and every time it has failed. For Europe, simply the problem of having all these very powerful states on a tiny continent. So again, a challenge with the dominance of the West, ending up not just fighting each other, but given that their maritime powers more powerful, they can also have always been able over the centuries to compete, not just directly but indirectly through their colonial possessions or fighting in third countries. But anyway, so what I find interesting is another contradiction within the West, because if you go back to the Greek city-states, there was always believed that it was this the lack of well, not maybe the cohesion, but it was the competition between these entities which really brought forward its energy and vigor in order to come up with new ways of developing economic systems or philosophy, law, or whatever it was. To a large extent is also what the United States, I believe, aspired to when they created this federation with very much a decentralized power in which each state could try out different paths. Now, my argument is that we never succeeded at this in terms of finding cohesion on the continent through diplomacy or power or war. But after the Second World War, I think this is quite a pivotal moment, because this is when the war devastates Europe. It also enables the US to take leadership in Europe as a pacifier, but also simply because it was dominant. And during the Cold War, I think a lot of the cohesion we had was simply because forming effectively a political West was very much dependent on the military rivalry of the Cold War as well. Also that this was with communist states. As a communist, they never had any competing economic statecraft which can compete for the loyalties of Europeans, because a lot of the conflicts we had came from geoeconomics or rival economic statecraft. Now, during the Cold War, because of the military tensions, it had a mitigating effect on this economic rivalry between the Western countries. And simply because there was such a high reliance on America's security guarantees, this also mitigated a lot of the tensions between the states. So I would say that Europe only emerged really as a cohesive grouping under US leadership and as a result of this rivalry with the Soviet Union. Now, and I think this is what created tensions after the Cold War, because after the Cold War, a lot of these things changed. First of all, you have now a lot of the former rivals, be it China and Russia, becomes other economic centers of power. They're also engaging in statecraft. There's more rivalry for economic loyalties, as we see now with the Chinese. Meanwhile, the lack of the same military rivalry creates makes less security dependence on the US, which means it can't really convert it to the same extent into political or economic loyalties. So you see a lot of the fragmentations within the West. And also, I think during the Cold War, the Europeans simply on the bipolar system were happy to ally themselves under the US out of necessity. After the Cold War, under the unipolar moment, the main objective of the Europeans was simply to establish a Europe collective hegemony based on two pillars. So you have United States and the EU holding up this unipolar moment. Obviously, this is also fallen apart as the Europeans are weakening more and more. And the Americans are working on, of course, cementing any political and economic loyalties, so cutting themselves off from other centers of power. Now, my point often is that I don't see the cohesion of the West or the political West to survive under a multipolar system, simply because these unique conditions aren't there anymore. If the Europeans have any value, Europe should have any value at all, they really have to diversify, but that diminishes some of the solidarity within the political West. So I look, I don't know, from a security and economic perspective, I think the political West is weakening. So as the West can no longer be dominant, and this is really a key role it had, I don't think it can be cohesive anymore either. I think it's entering a new stage. But again, I haven't really organized my thoughts around this topic yet. But I think exploring the West, can't really ignore the past 500 years of this very dominant position the West has had. And this is also a key reason why I think the West will have a bit of an identity crisis if it would, now that it has to essentially accept that it can't dictate to the world anymore. Now that the gravity of power is shifting towards Asia, I think it's going to be very difficult for the West to preserve its ideal of being this benign hegemon, preserving cohesion. Now bunch of other problems. At least I would foresee coming.
Thanks a lot, Glenn. Can I follow up with Arnaud's issue regarding Russia and put this to you, Glenn? On the background of what you were just saying in the end now, that I guess one of the crucial issues will probably be going forward how the civilizational background or coherence of supposed to West, to what extent that will play a role, and to what extent other more societal, political entity considerations will take more center stage, and how they interact. But Arnaud's issue regarding whether to what extent Russia is the West, and one additional thought I would like to bring, and before asking this, because I did some research into this and wrote this somewhere, that back in the early 2000s, I found a quote of Russian President Vladimir Putin saying, "Это одна цивилизация, this is one and the same, and this is the same civilization," talking about Europe, and then more broadly the West. So considering really this is one thing. Whereas in more recent quotations, I found one in 2000, I don't remember, 21 or 20, somewhere there. I found, I don't remember the quote, but it was, I paraphrase or translate, more focus on Russia as being its own but unique civilization, more focus, more emphasis on that. And one more thought, I mean, in my own journey towards East Asia, going through Russian studies and Russian, and then Chinese studies and Japanese studies, it was really the key experience that while in Russia, spending 2 summers in Russia, it still felt like there are no real limits to what is easily accessible. Someone would talk to me in the street, Maldo Cerviek, or young man, or I could be from there somehow. Whereas in China or in Japan, walking around the street, it's just different. It seems more different on the really, I think, attribute to the civilizational levels of Russia. For me, I experience it as being part of maybe the West, or the broader, relatively easily accessible world to me. But now it seems to be up to the Russians to know or to see how it is. But so clearly more proximity than, for example, China. But to what extent that is a proximity or not? How do you see this, Glenn?
Well, to see how Russia would deal with or identify with the West, again, this is why it's a good point of departure, as you said, to start with defining the West. And this is also why I think it's important to have, when you look at the West, to have these tensions between the pre-modern and the modern, because a lot of the West, which the Russians really wanted to join after the Cold War, was the West they saw as the liberal nation state. That's what they aspire to. So, and this is kind of an amalgam or a mixture of both, because the nation state based on, a people, faith, tradition, history, one culture, and this represents the group very. And then you have liberalism, which is focused on the individual and the rights of the individual. So carving out this piece, I think this was a nice balance that they wanted. I think the fragmentation now you have in the West is that the liberalism has to some extent divorced itself from the nation state. And I think that's a lot of the polarizations taking place within the West. So, for example, if obviously the polarization is quite obvious in the United States, but it's also in Europe. If you ask the Germans what is Europe, they will define it completely in the liberal values and cosmopolitan ideals. So it's so for example, let's say you have a refugee crisis. For the Germans, they will say European it's about embracing democracy, human rights. You have to accommodate those fleeing from wars. If you go to Hungary, for example, they define it more in terms of the prehistoric and preserving the nation state. That is, you want to reproduce your culture, your faith, your people. So for them, from their perspective, such a scenario would be damaging to them simply because, for example, having immigration inflows would prevent their ability to reproduce culture and faith. So again, when Orban says, his slogan essentially is, family, nation, God, this is not what the Germans consider to be European. So we have two different definitions. Is the pre-modern nation state or nation state born into modernity, or is it the liberal ideals? So I think for the Russians, they are associating more and you find them having more friends on the conservative sides with the Orbans of Europe, simply because that's how they also see connected with Europe. This is historically, they have been a European country culturally, well, since Kievan Rus as well. But at the moment, they're saying that they have nothing in common, essentially, with the Germans of Europe, but the Hungarians they see more connected to, simply because there's some historical past that connects them. But I also agree that the conflicts now has kind of shifted it a bit, because Russia is through its whole history, is kind of try to define or harmonize the West and the East, yes, and but for the past 300 years, under Peter the Great, development, modernization has always meant to Europeanize Russia, and this was something they complained about throughout the 19th century as well. People like Dostoevsky all pointing out that we can't be contribute anything to civilization or culture if we just try to emulate the Europeans. We have to have our own unique path. I guess a very conservative idea. And if you're going to have an organic path to development, you can't just copy the West, but then they also have to embrace this new Eurasian geography and identity. So I think now at the moment they're swinging a bit back to the East, where they're rejecting everything with the West simply because of the war and conflicts now. But I think over time they're going to try to position themselves somewhere in between, where they're part of Europe, but also consider themselves define wider as a civilization, which is not which has a lot being part of Europe, but also part of Asia. So at least this is how I see it, though.
Does anyone want to follow up on this, or shall I move? Thanks a lot.
I think Arnaud might have a thought. I see.
I think, I mean, we can speak about it in the next rounds. I was going to get into the solutions on transitioning to multipolarity, and how thinking about Russia as the West could help us with that. But maybe it's not the right time to speak about that, right, Stefan?
Then let me go with because actually you said many things on many dimensions and many, very interesting, ways to put forward, etc. But to maintain the initial structure a little bit, let me still to analyze the current moment. So the premise of this discussion, which is that whither post-unipolar West. So the supposition is that a unipolar moment and moving on beyond that in a multipolar world, what that should become. Let me quickly go through three assumptions which I find useful, and pardon to develop this very quickly, but it doesn't seem to be common knowledge or a common understanding regarding these assumptions, whereas they seem to be very well grounded and quite factual, but it's not that it's the starting point of all debates that I see around, be it in Switzerland or in German-speaking world, in French-speaking world, around the West. So the first assumption would be that we have lived for the past few decades in the unipolar moment, characterized by Western hegemony, by Western dominance across basically all spheres, geopolitical, economic, and also societal, but also in terms of worldview, philosophically and culturally. Secondly, this seems to be coming to an end, as we are in a transition towards a multipolar order that is in part already here, and driven in particular by Eurasian integration and Eurasian civilization states like China, India, Russia, and Iran. Although the unipolar hegemonic global order is still quite powerful, and many actors across the West are battling to keep hegemony going. Now, thirdly, so according to what I will call the official Western view, which is held by the European Union, NATO, the G7, and all the governments of these countries, and the media and political establishments more broadly, the West is characterized as democracy, freedom, human rights, and rule of law, abiding and promoting, both internally and globally, externally, while this is said to not be the case in much of the rest of the world, where autocracy, non-democracy, non-freedom, and absence of human rights and absence of rule of law is said to be the more dominant. In this official view, to go one step further, I think it's fair to say that the West is considered or assumed to be the good ones, which is the good ones, the good guys. So a de facto morally superior society or civilization built on morally superior values or ideas and principles. And secondly, second assumption there is that, well, in addition to this, we, the West, have the right or the duty to intervene globally based on these assumptions. Now, so related to these claims, the global order is usually called the rules-based global order, sometimes a value-based global order, liberal order, and is considered to be basically a good thing, or generally, mostly by tendency, a good thing. Now, and those who criticize this order, it seems to me, tend to come under the suspicion of having doubtful motives, of questioning the good universal values underlying this order and those shaping it. Now, there's also a different view, and this is, I think, the third assumption, which I...
Stefan, could I I'm terribly sorry for interrupting. I just have a bit of a emergency thing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I have to. I can probably come back and log on. I just have a family thing to take care of very quickly.
Sure, please go ahead.
Again, I'm terribly sorry.
Good luck.
Sorry.
Okay, to finalize it, so this third assumption would be that this take that I just described as the official Western view is not quite as tenable as many people would like to think, and that in reality, beyond the West's own propaganda, both in words, so for instance in the strategic documents which very clearly document and outline full spectrum dominance and containing countries, etc., or avoiding peer competitors, the emergence of peer competitors, etc., as well as in deeds, so through military interventions, regime change operations, unilateral sanctions, and other means of coercion, that the West is quite different. There's a gap between this official view and the real existing West, and that therefore the aspect of unipolar hegemon should be taken more seriously if one wants to maintain some pretension to intellectual and moral integrity. Now, this characterization, these three assumptions I wanted to put to you, so in this the first round regarding the analysis of the current moment, I mean, did I assume wrongly that you maybe have some sympathy to this view of the world that I just outlined, or what would you complement, or people is, I mean, anything regarding to analyze the current moment and the West's place in it? Who wants to
Can we do it, Arnaud?
Okay, I can go. So I think we're really in an unprecedented time. I mean, it has precedent, but not for a very, very long time. I think many people don't understand how rare the moment we're in is. The way I see it is that basically since the Industrial Revolution, so 18th century or so, the West has had a kind of unfair advantage, which gave it much more power against the rest of the world, and allowed it to dominate the world. And of course, you always have the ideological justification around that, which comes especially easy to the West because we've always been, as per our Christian roots, and even before Christianity, we've always had a deeply proselytizing spirit, where we are good. People who are not like us are therefore by definition bad. And we need to, transform them into us. So otherwise, they remain bad. That's kind of we have this very, very much black and white view of the world, and that's been the case for a very, very long time. And so, of course, as we came to dominate the world, we justified it in that language, where it's the mission civilisatrice of the French, is the British also were all about civilizing It's like the white man's burden, we're civilizing others, and so on and so forth. It's obviously, when you look at what was actually done, it's obviously ridiculous. If you look at the West actions, I mean, they started both world wars, right? There were only two, and both of them were started by the West. And if you look at the British in India alone, I don't remember how many deaths exactly they're responsible for. There was a study done, actually a book written by a famous Indian writer, and I think it came to 100 million victims. Something
is
like
that Shashi Tharoor or?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the book. Yeah, yeah. So I mean, yeah, that's we're very far away from human rights, right? And so the current moment that we're in is the first time where a truly non-Western country, which is China, finally emerges to be a peer competitor with the West, or at least the greatest power in the West, which is the US. And the last time that the West faced a truly non-Western challenger was the Ottoman Empire in the 15th and 16th century. So we're talking about something that hasn't happened for 500 years. And that's why it's creating so much trouble to our identity, because we've been so used to dominating the world, justifying it to ourselves, that we're going to take a very long time to adapt psychologically and culturally to a world where that's not the case, and that cannot be the case. We're re-entering into a world where that's just not going to be possible, because we don't have that power anymore, and we're not going to have it. If you look at China, they're quickly, well, actually, they're already there. If you look at the industrial production market share, they're bigger than the West, than all of the West. So that's what power is: how much you can produce. Like in case of a war between countries, that's basically what matters the most on your technology. If you look at technology, for most of the future technology, China is on par, if not ahead of the West. So that world where we could dominate the world is gone, and is gone for a long time, I think. And we're going to have to relearn how to cope with that. Actually, when you look in the past, we used to be able to do that. I really admire a Jesuit thinker and missionary called Matteo Ricci, who was one of the first Jesuit missionaries to go to China, and actually the man who translated for the first time the Chinese classics, so the analects by Confucius and so on, in Latin, which brought us our first understanding of Chinese civilization in Europe. At that time, because China was actually at that time much more powerful than Europe was, we were in a place where we didn't try to subdue them or submit them, sorry. We tried to understand them, because that's the only thing that we could do: understand others, to try to adapt to them, to try to defend our own interests, to try to trade with them in a way that was advantageous to us, respecting them, trying to earn respect back. it's all of that that we're gonna have to learn again in the future. So yeah, that's the way I analyze the present moment. Basically, this unprecedented situation, which leads to a deep identity crisis, and 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 to what I wanted to mention before, I think actually seeing Russia as part of the West can help us a lot with that, because Russia has already done a lot of that work. Russia, if you see them as part of the West, is one of the only Western nations that is already adapted to a multipolar world. I mean, they have a great relationship with China, they have a great relationship with India. They're actually respected by the global South, which is not the case of any other Western country. So there is a model of a Western country that's made that journey, and they very much moved from. They also had that crusading spirit, that proselytizing spirit under the Soviet Union of trying to convert the world in their image. I think, I mean, Russia at this moment has lost that. So, that's what we have to do too. So I think that's why it's useful also to see them as part of the West. I will end there.
Yeah,
Arnaud.
that was lovely. Mind if I say something as a follow-up to that?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, yeah, no, I really appreciated that a lot, and it brought to mind a couple of quotes as you were speaking, especially on Matteo Ricci, and I published a book a little while ago called Science Unshackled, and I put it in an appendix because I was trying to map out the two different traditions in the scientific world and philosophical world that also have been shaping this entity we've oversimplistically called the West, and it's like the way it's so oversimplified is numbing, and it's sad because we miss the drama, the contrast, the battles, the things that would make the study of this history so much more interesting. And the figure of Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz, came up quite extensively in this research because he wasn't just a statesman; he nearly became Prime Minister of England for Christ's sake. He was advising Sophie of Hanover as his student. But he was a grand strategist. He was corresponding with John Winthrop across the sea, trying to think about he was corresponding with missionaries in China. He was the privy counselor of Tsar Peter the Great, who commissioned him to map out an industrial program. He was privy counselor of Russia. Like, he was everything, and he was discovering the infinitesimal calculus. You're like, Christ, like, where are these people today? But he had this wonderful magazine that he began when he encountered the works of Matteo Ricci translated into I don't know what, he spoke like friggin' every language. So I don't know which language he encountered when he read this. But he said here in his first issue of probably
Latin. Yeah.
Must have been, yeah, because he published this in Latin. So it was a Latin journal. So yeah, but it was the Novissima Sinica, the news from China in 1697. And again, he's about to become the advisor to Peter the Great in a few years after he writes this. But he says here, I consider it a singular plan of the fates that human cultivation and refinement should today be concentrated, as it were, in the two extremes of our continent, in Europe and in China, which adorns the Orient as Europe does the opposite edge of the earth. Perhaps supreme providence has ordained such an arrangement so that, as the most cultivated and distant peoples stretch out their arms to each other, those in between may gradually be brought to a better way of life. And when you look at what he's doing by trying to think about this Eurasian, he's looking for the best, highest expression of various cultures, and he's trying to speak to that and amplify that as the basis of what we might call universal. Because the challenge that I think Russia has tackled much more effectively than especially the United States, I'm in Canada, but we've also screwed up on this question, and China's done a very good job too, is the question of the one and the many. So Leibniz was a Platonist. He wrote in Platonic dialogues. Plato doesn't give finished answers ever. He's always he's trying to stimulate the mind to learn how to identify paradoxes through dialectic. So he's trying to you can't say Plato's of the philosophical view, as is Leibniz, that you can't make explicitly literal the higher truths, because the higher truths are the effect of a creative discovery, which is profoundly subjective. And as soon as you try to like label it, formalize it so that people can memorize it, it kind of ironically undermines the transformative power of a discovery of that's sort of like a transformation of the mind from a state of ignorance into eureka, ah ha ha ha, like that. I got it. That thing in between the knowledge, the state of knowledge and the state of ignorance, that thing that allowed that qualitative transformation is more than the sum of detail that you could give somebody as formula or whatever to memorize, right? And so these people are profoundly sensitive to that, and they write in this way, which frustrates a lot of modern academics, I find. Many of the modern academics of our age are highly adapted and conditioned to expect crystallized answers, and they make crystallized statements that are just very rigid. And I think it's the consequence of just not having experienced in their own youth, in what their mind is capable of doing when it is not given answers. Like a good teacher doesn't give the student answers. The teacher is trying to give the student better questions so that the answer means something that they earn. They right. Um, so I think that we're currently in a situation that Leibniz was also dealing, because Leibniz was also refuting John Locke. He saw something very, very dark and dangerous inside of the writing of John Locke's essays on human understanding. And that's why Leibniz wrote the new essays on human understanding in response to John Locke. And he makes a point that John Locke, like Aristotle, a priori rejects the assumption that anything more than the five senses make up the substance of mind. He rejects the possibility that there might be a soul or something metaphysical. Um, he just rejects it. It's a blank slate. And Leibniz identifies that if you go with that assumption, then you will result in a society of might makes right. It will be quickly Hobbesian in practice if you will allow that, because what becomes true becomes who has the power to project their will onto the definitions of that shape people's standards and calibrate their behavior to whatever is normal. So there's no truth. It's all in the liberalist world that of a John Locke or a Hobbes, which presumes that the mind is the sum of the five senses. There is no ontological truth. There is just the truth of he who has the most power and can project it. So ironically, you've got this weird coexistence or promotion of liberalism of just like there's let's just accept everything. Let's just let everything be, and let's just, but at the same time you've got this perverse coexistence of this political expression of it in an imperial form, trying to homogenize everybody under one thing. So why was I saying Russia did this better? They resolved this problem better of the one and the many of Plato. Plato's always in his dialogues always trying to get us to think about how do you resolve the fact that everything that is ponderable exists as a one and as a many, and as an infinite. You could subdivide everything, but you could also look for, like there's a limited amount of organs of cells in my body that you could say is the many that make me up, but I'm one entity. I'm one Matthew. You're one Arnold. No, you're one Stefan. That's one Glenn. So politically speaking, Russia has what, 85, 86, I don't know, minority groups, ethnicities, and they've had a lot of multicultural ethnic groups which have given Russians a lot of opportunity to experiment. Well, how do we keep a cohesive civilization while at the same time not destroying everybody who's a minority group who has a different culture, a different language, a different idea of calling God something different? That's a challenging thing. China has fewer minority groups. They still have a good number of minority groups.
56.
And
Six.
six, yeah.
56.
Well, 56. 56 is pretty big.
Mm.
That's pretty big. It's not 80.
Yeah.
It's not 80, but it's big. And the US had a lot of natives when they arrived there, a lot of First Nations peoples. And you had some good people who gave it a good shot, like Ben Franklin and a lot of the people who Ben Franklin was working with and who came afterwards, who we're trying, I think, very nobly to preserve and respect the differences of the Cherokee, and while at the same time giving and having the idea that no, we can find common ground based on our common humanity. We all love our children. We all have the right to learn technology. And many members of the Cherokee were very happy to utilize so-called Western tools and Western techniques in order to apply to agriculture, which had certain disruptive aspects to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But at the same time, it wasn't it didn't it wasn't based on a destruction of their lifestyle either, like of their sacred myths, of their culture, of their stories, of their life that was being preserved. And in fact, you had better quality missionaries like Matteo Ricci mindset missionaries who are going in trying to think, okay, how can we find the best of the West and the best of what you have, and create something that is beautiful, that respects the difference while at the same time introduces something that is truly universal. We all want to make the world better for our kids. Okay, so let's have an economic program that could. And then you had, unfortunately, too many cases of ignorant imperialist racists like Andrew Jackson and so many of these other more, uh, embodiments of the worst of Western tradition, if you want to call it that, who had the very different idea that no, we have to take our idea of manifest destiny, which became a racist view of just destroying anything which is different, and homogenizing the state towards some racial superior idea of humankind. And it did a lot of damage. And we saw Cecil Rhodes doing his variation of the thing in Africa, of a manifest destiny that crushed the traditions of the people who had been living there for millennia. But then I look at China, I look at Russia, especially, China's approach is based on economic development. They're like, okay, we all want to make life better. So you see the way that in Xinjiang, and some people listening to this might be emotionally inflamed because maybe they've been reading or watching Fox News or CNN. I don't know. I don't think so. I think people watching your program, Stefan, would probably not be watching mainstream Fox News for their information. But you look at practically what China has done in Xinjiang, and I mean, you have community centers that are teaching that are promote, and you have mosques, and you have community centers in Tibet that are protecting and enriching their Tibetan culture and Buddhism, and but at the same time you can have high-speed rail accessing different parts of Xinjiang more effectively and cheaper than you can anywhere in Canada. And you have like a real idea of, okay, we'll use technology to make life better, living standards increase, quality of life, longevity increases, abundance increases, but at the same time there's this amplification of cultural, that what makes you a diverse and special person. That's also very, very high concern for the Chinese, and in Africa too. Their approach to, I look at CGTN in Africa, and it's like they're doing what we failed to do. They're not trying to crush the natives. They're trying to elevate people, looking for the best of their traditions of these different cultures that they interface with, and they're trying to bring that out. And again, when I look at Leibniz, Glenna, you missed it, but I just read a little quote at the very beginning of by Leibniz on the embrace of Russia and China and Europe, that would uplift everyone in between. And Arnaud had talked about Matteo Ricci as another representative of a better way of thinking about what is the West, what could, how does the West take a Renaissance quality of excellence and not simply turn it into liberal imperialism, but look for the best thing in those different peoples that he encounters. So yeah, those are just my considerations of this platonic one in the many balance. How do you do it? How do you not take some sort of a an ultra Darwinian, idea of homogenizing humanity? Darwin even said he got his idea of survival of the fittest as the explanation, the explanatory mechanism for the changing of species, why some species disappear and other species change and thrive. He described it in his autobiography as having been the consequence of him having read Thomas Malthus's essays on the principle of population. And he describes, like, it was only by appreciating the battle for diminishing returns that I began to finally appreciate what the mechanism might be that would describe the fossil records changing. And so, he's basically taking Malthus and applying it to the biological world, and then telling Francis Galton, his cousin, and Herbert Spencer, and Thomas Huxley, his bulldog, that that I've become a disciple of Galton. That I believe now in I've made it. Galton has made a convert of me in terms of the social human application of the survival of the fittest. Uh, as far as the human application of it. So it's basically just taking what was already there in Malthus, calling for regulating overpopulation by a hereditarily more fit, elite caste that must make the tough decisions to manage global population. And then sort of gave it a bit of a spin, and then brought it back into justifying the expansion of empire and the homogenization of culture, as the most fit spreads itself increasingly around the world. And this became the roots of eugenics. We saw this at the heart of the growth of fascism as the sort of the religion of the elites, the wannabe elites of Europe, whether in Germany or England or anywhere. And then you could just see how this stuff just was rebranded after World War II, which we know a bunch of Nazis didn't lose and a bunch of fascists didn't lose. They were given new assignments by Alan Dulles and British intelligence like Bandera and so many others into the Gladio operations, NATO's secret armies. And eugenics didn't disappear. You got Julian Huxley, who's still the president of eugenics while he's setting up UNESCO in 1946. He's still the president. He's still running. He's working with Prince Bernhard and Prince Philip, for Christ's sakes, and setting up the World Wildlife Fund as the president of eugenics in 1960. And you got this guy creating the new label of transhumanism with Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. They're like saying, oh yeah, we can revamp the word eugenics has gotten a bad name, but it's still the queen of all sciences, so we have to give it a new name. And this is what becomes like at the foundation of this rules-based order, in a sense, of just the expansion of whatever it's Silicon Valley transhumanism, or the thing that increasingly brainwashed useful idiots to to be in charge of homogenizing Europe under some weird central command, in a new technocratic cult. But it's this guy, and they want to lay claim to being the owners of Western civilization and the definitions of it. They don't believe in truth; they just believe in imposing their will to power. And it's icky, it's gross. Sorry, that was my rant.
How about let me quickly take stock because we're already an hour and almost half or so in. How about Matt? Can I ask you to add a quick some elaborations on the analysis of the current moment and the West place in it? So to keep the thing here, and before I would like to put Glenn, who was quickly away because probably couldn't follow everything. So can you add some considerations about the current moment and the West place in it, and then I would like to ask Glenn to add on this quickly as well. Before then, maybe we can do a last round rather than two more rounds, as I had imagined, maybe where we will then talk about absence of imagination within the West, absence of even awareness of this need to transition to a new, maybe a post-unipolar identity. Can you do that, Matt?
Yeah, quickly. I think that there's an existential crisis in the thing called the West, and I think that currently the recognition that the economic system that was believed to be the hegemonic forever system in 1992, is not going to last much longer. They can't keep this zombie thing afloat that much longer. They've already artificially kept it somewhat alive when it probably should have collapsed if it left to natural law back in 2008. So it's been, we've been injecting blood into the corpse. And I think that a bunch of civilizational forces, a lot of leaders who are really representing a maturity, what gives me some confidence and hope in Eurasia and Russia and increasingly the global South, have gotten out of the building. If it was 12, 13 years ago, as some technocrats would like it to be, they would like to go back in time to when, Putin was still willing to join NATO. They want to go into a time machine. They're not going to. But if it was, and they blew out the system, I think it would have been a lot more devastating globally. Today, I think there's been the creation of an alternative economic architecture, which is still primitive. It's not able to withstand a collapse, but it's in a much better place than it would have been 10, 12 years ago before the Belt and Road Initiative was announced. So I think you have such a system of increasing excellence and the utilization of the best traditions of Western economic practice that's defining the creation of productive credit, the idea of a philosophy of win-win cooperation, which again, I see it there when I read Leibniz, when I read Gilpin or FDR's philosophy and his policies. So that heritage is being picked up, that torch is being picked up by the Eurasian leadership right now around the multipolar alliance. And I think there's probably a faction within the Western managed oligarchy or kakistocracy or whatever, which invested so much effort and time and energy into this end of history agenda that they're willing to risk thermonuclear war to destroy those who they perceive to be placing their right to rule the world forever at risk. And then I think there's evidence of other more practical minded groupings within the Western plutocratic or oligarchic class that recognize that it's better to live to fight another day, and would probably do well to change, kind of like the British aristocracy did in the 1940 period, where they realized, okay, our Hitler model isn't working the way we wanted it to. We should probably abort. And some were willing to go along with the pro-British Hitler model, and others were not. And we saw that they aborted to live to fight. They weren't good. They just wanted to fight another day. Because the program they had put forth wasn't operating the way they wanted to. So I feel like we have parallels there, and we could face, we see what Biden has apparently, I don't even know if I haven't gotten full guarantees that he actually said this, or that this is not New York Times. Do we know? Did we get confirmation 100% that Biden has given authorization to utilize to carry out strikes into Russia? Is that 100%?
I think so,
Well,
because they did it.
they attacked Bryansk region, yeah.
They did. Yeah, okay, of course.
But nonetheless, the reason for the confusion is I think it's the State Department or spokesperson for White House, whatever, they're still saying they don't want to confirm anything just yet. I think it's just a way of avoiding being able to walk it back, because it's such a huge escalation. Russia considers this a direct attack for very good reasons. So I think they're giving themselves some leeway to walk it back, depending on how Russia reacts. So, but yeah, that is the reason why it's a bit unclear, because he said they would do it. At least they reported in the media. Then Bryansk was attacked, but they're still suggesting, well, can't confirm anything. So it's yes. They're dishonest, but yeah, the strategic ambiguity. I think it's for give room for maneuver, though.
Glenn, can
So
you?
yeah, that's dangerous. That's that. I'll just end it with that. I think that there is a danger right now of a certain flight forward that might risk lighting the earth on fire for the sake of their perceived right to control forever. And then I hope to God that the better, more reasonable, pragmatic thinkers, who are not good people, but pragmatic about their self-interest, have some political influence that can steer this thing in a slightly different direction. But that's my take.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Glenn, can I ask you to give your analysis of the current moment and the West's place in it?
Well, I thought the word you used before, lack of imagination, is a good thing, because I think what we need now is a huge adjustment. But I think it's also important to have some understanding why it's difficult in the West to imagine something else. If you only look at the United States, for example, this obviously would feel it wasn't difficult to sell the end of history thesis to the United States. If you look at its rise, I mean, it started with these colonies on the eastern coast. They gradually expand through the continent, and they have effectively the dominance over all of Americas. Then they extend into the Pacific. After World War II, they have a dominance. Well, they're one of the two main powers. after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They're the hegemon. So it's not a problem to see why this draw a straight line from manifest destiny to to this global primacy. Now, and I think also for the Europeans after World War II, all this destruction, the post-Second World War era became, I guess, a time of redemption. Instead of being a destroyed continent, it could rebuild. You had unity, the right values, all of these things. So by the time the main rival, the Soviet Union, turned out to be ineffective, ideologically unable to deliver, the hubris obviously kicks in for full. And this is why the end of his history thesis has been so dominant. I think this has shaped very much the thinking of the entire political class over the past 30 years. And this is and the liberal hegemon after the Cold War. I think this was kind of got across a consensus across all ideologies, because on one hand, one can argue that by having a dominant West, you can overcome the international anarchy. No more should we have great power rivalry, because if there's one dominant state, that will mitigate the security competition, as the United States put it in its own security strategy. Even any state or group of states shouldn't even have the aspirations to challenge the leadership of the US. So this kind of became the source for canceling out the anarchy, simply because there is one center of power. And then this also harmonizes with the liberal ideals, because if the US and the collective West or political West dominates, now the role of liberal democratic values will be elevated in the international system, will essentially transcend power politics altogether. So either if you look at power or values, you can see why this was sold as a good idea. And this has shaped the whole thinking after the Cold War, because this allowed the West to go back to our very comfortable position in which we are dominant, but we're also a force for good because we have these benign hierarchies. So what were the main discussions through the 90s and early 2000s? Well, at least when the Europeans or EU engaged with the rest of the world, they even used the words like socialize. Well, we have a NATO, EU, they have a socializing role. We're socializing the rest of the world to become like us because we broke the code. We transcended history. And I think this is where we find this the sweet spot where we can dominate over others, but it's to their own advantage. So it becomes a new civilizing mission. In the literature, they even refer to it as a teacher-student relationship, which is why our diplomacy isn't even about mutual understanding and harmonizing interests. It's about rewarding or punishing others to behave correctly, to continue the path to be more like us. So this has shaped the entire thinking. And then suddenly, of course, we see, I think what was unavoidable is the West exhausted itself. So you can look at the economic aspect. I think Matthew got into this as well. The whole rent-seeking economy, which has been built up, especially under the United States, they can't compete anymore with the industrial capitalism of China. So it's not competitive anymore. Europe also becomes increasingly irrelevant because, as you see, all centers of power now in a multipolar system, they're seeking multi-vector foreign policy. They want to diversify their economic ties. The Europeans cutting themselves from all centers of power, only the United States, they're becoming less relevant. Meanwhile, the US, its ambitions to dominate the world, it's no longer reflected in reality or the balance of power. That is, it's exhausting its resources, and you see this with economics exhaustion, social, political fragmentations. And what does it achieve? Can it restore the 90s? No, it only inspires collective balancing, not just they're worried about the Chinese and Russians coming together. They should be more worried about BRICS, that even their friends and allies don't want to live in the unipolar moment. They want multipolarity so they can have more independent foreign policy. So for no one, so I very much agree. There's no going back to the 90s, but we don't have any political imagination for anything else. This was going to be a collective hegemony of the political West, perpetual peace, not just for our sake, but our leadership would be the benefit of the world. And now suddenly we are, falling back into this great power politics, going back into the past. The Europeans will be obviously less relevant. The US, I think for the first time in its history, is taking a step down from its perpetual rise in the international system. So there's no there's no good way out of this. And when you add this very ideological fundamentalism, which has been brewing in the West now for decades, this idea that everything is good versus evil, you have the democracy versus authoritarianism. I think this just adds to the lack of willingness to find compromise and mutual understanding. So I think for some people, the idea of withdrawing back into another Cold War actually seems a bit of a it becomes almost a security blanket. It's a little bit comfortable because, well, this was a predictable, well, maybe not so predictable, but it's a familiar past. We were the good guys; they were bad. We eventually prevailed. It's better than the confusing present, I think. And also for the Americans, they can get ensure that the Europeans go back to being obedient and loyal instead of trading with its adversaries. So obviously, I think this is a colossal mistake, but I think this is also lack of this political imagination. And actually, George Kennan made this. I think he used the same words in the 90s when he said, "Why are we expanding NATO? We have finally we can transform, change, create a completely different world, and instead we're going back into block politics, less expanding alliances, competing over who stays inside, who stays outside, where do the dividing lines go?" So I think, I think we are promoting a very going down a very self-destructive path, and there's very little room for course correction because in all this insecurity we're now feeling, there's demand for full loyalty. So anyone who criticizes the self-destructive policies are, met with suspicions. I think this is what Matt also referred to. This is very neo-McCarthyist way. There's no way of attempting to do course correction without being a puppet of Putin or Xi or selling out to authoritarians, and it's just it's very unhealthy. And no, I'm very pessimistic. I think the ideal path for the West should be to first accept reality, and this is that the world is already multipolar, and the West should try to find its own place in this international system. We have West as civilization has a lot of great history, tradition, values. If we can have a more modest aspiration for our role in the world, be able to climb down from this demand for dominance, I think a lot of the problems could be solved. Even America's efforts to all of their pursuit of these very powerful industrial policies. I'm actually a big fan of the American system and Alexander Hamilton, and so I don't actually mind when Trump speaks of industrial policies. The problem is this has to be done in moderation. If the goal is to dominate as well, you have to destroy the Chinese economy. Now everything is on steroids, and I think the American economy will collapse long before they're able to dismantle the Chinese. So I think, again, moderation. I think have a modest position in the international system. I think a lot of the problems of the West could be resolved. And just to finish off again on Adam Smith, he actually made this point as well when he wrote that if the Europeans got a little bit weaker or the rest of the world a bit stronger, the asymmetries would be flattened out a little bit. We might have more harmony in the international system, less. So I'm. But of course, selling the idea of a diminished position in the international system it's not just treasonous in the West now for suggesting we shouldn't dominate, but it's also a betrayal of our sacred values, which are apparently or allegedly dependent on our continued dominance. So, no, I think we're going to go through some trouble. If we survive it, we'll hopefully readjust. But yeah, sorry, that was my rant.
Thanks a lot, Glenn. I think this sets it up perfectly for maybe a last round around what I had initially thought would be two issues. I mean, if we stay in the initially planned time frame, I think that we just have time for a proper last round around the issues. You spoke to this already now, Glenn, quite a lot, quite a bit, but still, so this, how to better understand and explain this absence of imagination within the West, and absence of even awareness of this need to switch towards, well, to a multipolar setting and be to a post-unipolar version of oneself. What are the, well, the maybe even the philosophical, civilizational, ideological obstacles to that, and what is the, on the societal, well, economic, political level, these various levels, how to understand this and explain this better. And, well, secondly, to still brainstorm, you also did some of this, Glenn, actually very fascinatingly just now, but ideas towards how to, well, to better grasp this or even tackle this challenge, well, ways forward towards maybe a sane, tenable, sustainable, forward-looking, healthy version of the West. Arnaud, do you want to go?
Sure. So on transitioning to multipolarity, I mean, obviously, I completely agree that we are in a multipolar world, and that our key challenge is to transition from a universal civilizational model, where we see our model as the only one, to one among many. And currently, we're crazily unprepared to this at all levels: psychological, institutional, economical. So, you know, for instance, I was listening to Adam Tooze the other day, who is a historian and economist. And he had this quote that I found quite striking. He said the first China shock was when China was incorporating into our supply chains. The second China shock is when we beg to be incorporated into theirs. Because he made the point that today, as it stands, China entirely dominates the global manufacturing ecosystem, and that if we want to regain some industry, which to an extremely large extent have been lost in the West, we can either try to kind of recreate a parallel, less efficient economic system, in a way like the Soviet Union did in its fight with during the Cold War, or we can integrate, do the way China did it, which is they incorporated into our supply chain, they learned from us, and then bit by bit they develop their own system. So I think obviously the second way is the smarter way, but it requires us to acknowledge that obviously China is leading in many ways, and we need to be humble to the fact that in many sectors now we need to learn from them more than they need to learn from us. And I think maybe at least the economic actors are maybe starting to get there. We saw the news a couple of days ago, which was very, very interesting, that now the EU for batteries is starting to ask for tech transfer from Chinese companies if they want to have full market access to the EU. So this is an acknowledgement that China is ahead technologically, because we need to acquire their tech, right? And it shows that we're becoming more humble and recognize that bit by bit we need to learn from China in certain sectors. So I wouldn't be. There are some little signs that start to emerge that maybe minds are starting to evolve around that. But still, the challenge is absolutely enormous. And that's why I think, also back to my point earlier, thinking about Russia as part of the West might help us with that, because they've done a lot of this and they can teach us a lot. Like they're starting to set up many institutions that are multipolar institutions, and not anymore sort of Western-centric unipolar institutions. We might want to start to either join those or develop those kinds of institutions as well, to integrate more into a multipolar world. We need, stuff like new forums for multi-civilizational dialogue. We need to, I think, do a lot of educational transformation to move beyond Western-centric narratives in history, philosophy, social science. Introduce like comparative civilizational studies, things like that. Fund research on non-Western governance model, alternative development path. There are so many things we need to do, or the whole media transformation. Like, the media is a very, very big problem, I think, right now in the West. And we see that through, all the stories, be it in Ukraine, be it when it comes to Israel and Gaza. The bias is extraordinary, and it really shapes the way we see things. So we need to transform our media ecosystem in depth to incorporate non-Western perspective, challenge biases, develop expertise in understanding others. So yeah, big transformation is needed. But the multipolar world is here to stay. I think it's a reality that is structural. That's not going to change, and so we have no other choice than to adapt, or we're going to completely isolate ourselves from the rest of the world and end up with something, situation kind of similar to the Soviet Union, where we rot on ourselves.
Great, thanks a lot, Arnaud. Matt, you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I've been talking a lot about this with Ed Lazansky, because we're starting a new initiative. We began this couple of months ago, just to try to stimulate these kinds of dialogues, this sort of thing. It's great. And we're just bringing online something called the Academy for International Cooperation, to just try to like brainstorm and encourage this type of dialogue with experts, and ideally we want to bring in more policymakers as well. And so yeah, this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I the cultural problem for me is so important at the end of the day, because the culture is what shapes how we think about everything. It's not really about the details of what we think about particulars, but it's the whole how we formulate our identity, our judgment values, how we discern. And this is stuff that not enough people, I think, pay enough attention to. The Chinese do. They're going through a Confucian Renaissance, right? Like the most powerful qualities of their deep history are there. There's a very high priority at making this popular. The studies of the analects, the Confucian classics, and they're promoting the best quality of Buddhist teachings as well to their Buddhist population. It's just, and you see it in the movies and the shows. My wife watches and I watch a lot of Chinese shows, and just they're fun to watch, but there's things that I don't see in the Western cultural sphere at all. There, as far as like moral values in every show, there's temperance, there's insights that are being trained through entertainment into the viewers, which is making them more discerning, more appreciative of the nature of what it means to be human, that are being embedded in a very rich way within multi-layered stories. A lot of them taking place in, the Tang Dynasty, Han Dynasty, so it's really cultural education going on. It's science, you got Chinese astronauts giving regular, scientific demonstrations to kids all across China. You get 90 million kids tuning in live to talk to astronauts doing, experiments on like what does fire do in space and zero gravity. And it's exciting. It's exciting stuff. Um, so you have a culture of meritocracy where people are given much more opportunity to rise, to gain responsibilities as they demonstrate capacity and merit, both on every level, municipal, within industry, and within the government on a federal level. So it's quite interesting to look at, which is far more rich than the Western labels of it's communist, that it's like brain dead. But the way I see it is the embrace of culture from the higher appreciation of the word, and their embrace of a pro-industrial economic model is very important, because the danger with economic abundance is exactly what we saw destroy the West. Is, you create abundance, you run a danger now of decadence. Machiavelli talked about this as well in his discourses on Livy. That this is a risk you're going to take. If you allow abundance, you now run a risk of people becoming slothful, becoming too materialistic, becoming the bourgeoisie, effect sloppy-minded people. It's to be a risk. So you always have to have your culture that's shaping the moral value structures and the appreciation of the higher aesthetics, higher beauty, not the lower beauty, but the higher beauty. That always has to be growing at a faster rate, as fast, if not faster, than the technological advances that allow for increased bounty. And if one slides and if the culture becomes decadent and degenerate while you have a technological excellence, it'll make a mess. It'll go empire fast. And that people like what we have today is a people who got too adapted to this lie that we could live forever as a consumer society, and we could be good citizens by going to the shopping mall and buying. And if somebody would ask, where's our factories? Where's our manufacturing? Canada used to have a lot more than we do today. We're told, well, that's the old wisdom. We have people doing that dirty work that we don't have to look at. And what's not stated is that it's expected that they stay poor, so that their labor remains cheap, so that they could fill up our dollar stores. And if they start developing, their labor will be more expensive, and then we can't get our cheap goods, our cheap stuff. So we stripped ourselves, and the money in circulation, the value in the Western system is tied to activity which is not productive. And the math, there's a lot of mathematical thinking that tries to treat, like, all things being equal, China has money, we have money, it's all the same thing. And it's like, well, no, 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 no. Because if the behavior of the monetary system is tied to goals that are going to increase the quality of life of the people on the individual, municipal, and federal level, as well as the security of the nation, because you're going to be looking to your neighbors to see, like, how can you stabilize your neighbors, knowing that your neighbors being stable and not being blown up, make better business clients, like better, and also more trustworthy neighbors, because they appreciate that you've helped them build a rail line in Kenya, or they appreciate that you've assisted their ability to help themselves. That's just better security. It's better self-interest. It's not angelic. China's going to get stuff too. They're going to get minerals. We would too. We would too. That's what JFK did when he built the Volta River Dam in Ghana with Kwame Nkrumah. The idea was the U.S. was going to get preferential access to a variety of minerals that are in Ghana, but we would help Ghana build this high-tech, hydroelectric dam, which was done, but it was sabotaged. So it's good common sense business, and it also is in alignment with humanity, and our higher self-interest. So I think we have to, like you guys have been saying, we got to eat some humble pie, if we're gonna have a future, and realize, I don't know if this is possible. I don't know if humility with the current governing class is possible. Maybe not. Maybe it's not, but I hope it is. There might be a transition. I think that there's an idea right now of restoring some the more rational level-headed part of the oligarchy that's running the West that I see tends to be pushing a little bit more towards restoring the balance of powers, the Cold War, basically the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, and try to like live to fight another day, reconsolidate power in the part of the world, the Americas and Europe that we have more influence in, and like retreat on the war front. Other aspects of the oligarchy that I'm seeing are pushing forward for the war thing, even if it means nuclear war. And then maybe there's people, again, I said this earlier, with some influence, who might have some influence with Trump, and I hope so, that see business opportunities within the Belt and Road, and with Russia's offers that have been made to build the Bering Strait rail tunnel in 2007 and 2011, and then China reamplified that message and offer in 2014. And Trump in 2020 said he gave an executive order supporting the building of the Alaska-Canada Railway. And it was done based on the growth model of China as the business partner that we would be tapping into by building rail and tapping into the resources that we currently cannot access in the Arctic, which is better than the militarization of the Arctic, which is currently being done under Justin Trudeau, of installing long-range missiles in the Canadian Arctic in preparation for an assault onto Russia. So the economic orientation of Trump in 2020, and which I hope can come back again, is much more preferable to the current thing. So we'll see. That's my take.
Excellent. Glenn, do you want to take the floor once more and add your thoughts?
No, well, to summarize, I think the main challenge for the West now is to learn to, transition away from this dominant position, which is already gone, without throwing out the baby, of course, with the bathwater being a reference to actually Western civilization. Because again, there's a lot of great things to preserve, but it's also, I think, we're worth again going back to this idea, be it core warnings, with the British liberal empire in 19th century, or the American liberal hegemony, or collective West liberal hegemony, was the main concern. Also, over time, empire would corrupt and destroy these values, and the empire would exhaust itself. So, and I think this is also what's happened. So it's worth going back even back to the days of Woodrow Wilson. Keep in mind that at this point, when in the defense of these values, what was the main rhetoric around the time? Was you should make the world safe for democracy, and let's fight the war to end all wars. I think this is America shifted dramatically from being a beacon to be emulated, but something you can't do when you exhaust yourself through empire, and instead became more of a crusader state. So, and that's what we've seen. Values exhausted. It's hardly much to brag about these days in terms of human rights. The democracy, and of course, media has become very corrupted. We now suddenly learn genocide is not such a bad thing anyways, so if we're just defending ourselves. And but at the same time, empire is lost. So, and I think this is also a key challenge, the decline, because as one is decadent, you see this something common with the collapse of civilizations. Not to be over dramatic, but there's a lack of energy, optimism. What is there to really be excited about? As also Matt and Arnaud pointed out, they say, oh, the stock market went up. Yeah, this is what's supposed to drive the energy of a culture, of a civilization, even though salaries stay stagnant. I mean, it's a bit absurd. And I think there's a lot of things we could be excited about with the rise of Asia. You can, Europe, Asia could be connected. You can try to find real solutions to big problems in the world, instead of just going into this alliance systems. Everything is zero sum. So I think there's a lot of opportunities, but I think we closed ourselves off, and by not seeing this, given that we're so determined on restoring hegemony. So I learned a Chinese expression lately, which was a few weeks ago, which was something along the line, if you take a step backward, the world will look much bigger. And it makes a lot of sense, and I think that's what we have to do as well. We locked ourselves away too much into this, going back to the 90s, in which all the possibilities, all the things to be excited about goes away, and we end up in this decadent position. And I see this also in the education sphere. Keep in mind, China now is beginning to, they have a lot of reason to be optimistic. They're beginning to take leadership in almost all fields. Meanwhile, you see in the US, they still lead in finance, law, and psychology. Finance, because all the debt being shuffled around, law as they all begin to sue each other, and psychology as mental illness spread across society. But this is not, it doesn't take a genius to understand why this is not sustainable or healthy. So no, I think there's a lot of great days ahead for the West if we can just, again, back to Adam Smith, adjust this away from dominating and ruling the world allegedly for the benefit of all, and have the imagination to pursue a different, more moderate role in the international system.
Well, I think this session was as intense and deep and dense as I had hoped it was going to be, and I think there's a lot to take out of it and to pursue. I will myself try to think about this and hopefully write and talk. Let me thank you very much, the three of you again, for participating. Yes, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.